Alright, well, last time we left off in The Amazing Spider-Man with the Kingpin kidnapping or capturing Spider-Man and strapping him to a table next to this other guy for some means that we're not sure of yet. And then in the Spectacular Spider-Man, Tarantula kidnapped the university president or something like that, and then tried to kill the mayor, and Spider-Man saves the mayor, but then the tarantula escapes. So that's that. Now let's move on to the review because we got a lot to get to. So let's get to it. Alright, the way I'm going to do this is I'm going to be jumping back and forth between Amazing Spider Man and Spectacular Spider Man because they do kind of reference each other, so I feel like there's some kind of specific order that they're in. They don't like alternate one and then the other and then the other and then the other because some of them have storylines that cross over multiple issues, so it's like they can't really weave in between those. So it'll just have to be that way for now. That's how I'm doing it this time. We'll see how it goes in the future. Alright, the first issue of Amazing Spider-Man this year. 164. Kingpin is trying to take Spider-Man's life force and transfer it to his son. So he does it. And then, yeah. And I don't understand why these battles don't make more news headlines. Like the Kingpin tells of like this huge battle that he fought with giant mechanical monster created by the Red Skull, and I don't know, I guess stuff like that doesn't make the papers because it seems like, Spider-Man didn't know about it or something. It seems like kind of big news to me. Also, I should probably read Captain America because it sounds pretty awesome. But yeah, anyway, Spider-Man creates a device with Dr. Connors, aka the Lizard, that steals the life force back. So Spider-Man fights and defeats Kingpin, and then Kingpin's son Richard remains alive somehow. He maintained his strength long enough to something or other. Moving on. Okay, issue number 2 of Spectacular Spider-Man. There was a funny little joke. He's swinging around on this boat, or like swinging past this boat, and like this one person in the boat is like, "Hey, there's that spider guy," you know? And I don't know. I thought it was kind of funny. And so did Spider-Man too. He was like mentioning about how people don't even know his name and stuff. Anyway, Kraven and the Tarantula are hired to kidnap some school chancellor, and then they do it. And then Tarantula delivers the Chancellor to their employer while Kraven stays behind to fight Spider-Man for revenge. Spider-Man wins, and then Tarantula is gassed by his employer, whose identity is kept secret because he's shrouding his face in darkness in every shot. And then, alright, in the next issue, number 3, the guy the Tarantula kidnapped in the first issue turns out to be behind the whole thing. The guy that was like president of the university or whatever. He was a professor at the college, studied light, made some gizmo that allowed him to control solid light, use it as like a punch to the face. He called himself Light Master. And Spider-Man fights and defeats him, and like a villain. And I like the villain. I do. But I have one complaint. He could use his ability to harness light to fly. Like he can fly because of it. But he couldn't travel the speed of light. Should have been able to travel the speed of light. That would have made him a lot more intimidating and dangerous. Maybe if I ever get a crack at the Spider-Man franchise. But yeah, then Flash ran into some girl he knew from Vietnam called Shashan. We saw her in a while back when he was people were trying to kill him from his past. Anyway, 165 of Amazing Spider-Man. A dinosaur man named Stegron reanimates some dinosaur bones at a museum. Spider-Man fights him, but Stegron defeats him and escapes. Dr. Connors turns into the Lizard because of the whole thing. Peter and MJ work out some stuff with their relationship, and they're pretty much peaches and cream again. Yeah. Also, yeah, the Stegron kidnapped Dr. Connors' son. So, yeah. Issue 166. Harry and Liz get engaged. So, congrats. And Spider-Man fights Lizard and Stegron. And Lizard turns back into Dr. Connors, and Stegron gets away. And as Spider-Man rushes off to find Stegron, Connors says, "I won't just twiddle my thumbs." He only has one thumb because he's Dr. Connors. He has one arm. I know I'm splitting hairs here, but still, gotta pay attention to these things, editors. Anyway, dinosaurs causing havoc in the streets. Connors de-animates them, and their bones fall on the street. He reverses some device that the Stegron used. And then Stegron can't handle the cold because he's cold-blooded, and he falls into a frozen pond. Presumably he dies, hopefully, because he really did not care for that character. Yeah, but, they always bring people back from the dead. And anyway, issue 4 of Spectacular Spider-Man. The Vulture comes out of hiding to get revenge on Spider-Man, and a rising mob boss is made a fool by the Vulture and seeks revenge on the Vulture. He hires somebody called the Hitman. And then in issue 5, the Hitman is hired to kill Spider-Man and take away the Vulture's revenge. And then after several encounters, Spider-Man defeats Vulture and Hitman and runs away. So yeah, the Vulture isn't a bad villain. I used to hate him before I actually started reading these and before I knew anything about him. I was just like, Vulture. But I enjoy a lot of these Vulture stories. They're not too bad. Yeah. So, in issue 167 of The Amazing Spider-Man, Jameson hires somebody to build him another Spider Slayer, and he fails in his first encounter with Spider-Man. And then there's also some orb of light hijacking trucks. Turns out to be some guy who can control his body's molecules. Spider-Man steals some pictures Jameson has that are supposedly evidence of something, and then Spider-Man runs into the Orb Man and then immediately tries to fight him. Before saying anything to him, he sees him and starts to fight him. And I have to question why. Because he just there's no reason for him to fight him. He could have just been like, "Hey, what are you doing? Who are you?" At least get some information first before you immediately start throwing punches. I don't know. It's Len Wein. I don't like his writing. I don't know. But then after some failed attempts at punching the Orb Man, Jameson's Spider Slayer shows up, which he can control with his mind. He has this helmet thing, and he's sitting comfortably in some office somewhere and controlling this thing. But it has his face on the screens like the other ones did. Anyway, issue 168 of Amazing Spider-Man. Jameson fails in his fight against Spider-Man, and the Orb Man, he's called Will-O-the-Wisp, that's his tentative title, gets called back to a guy named Jonas Harrow before the fight begins. And Spider-Man looks at the pictures that he stole, and they are of him dumping his clone into the incinerator. And he does some kind of altering he just kind of mentions it, and you see him put the pictures back in Jameson's office, and he makes a lock pick out of webbing. Yeah, you can do that. And Spider-Man then fights Will-O-the-Wisp, and Wisp says that Dr. Harrow can kill him with the press of a button. And he has to consciously keep his molecules together by willpower. And all Wisp wants is just to become human again, but Harrow is making him kill Spider-Man before he grants him that wish. And Wisp defies Harrow, and Harrow presses the button that makes him disintegrate into thin air. And I really like Will-O-the-Wisp. He's a good villain. Don't really care for the name though. He's definitely a cool villain. And then in issue 169 of Amazing Spider-Man, Jameson confronts Peter. He thinks Spider-Man killed Peter and then has been impersonating him. And he shows him the photos of Spider-Man dumping Peter's body, which is actually the clone from the Jackal issue. And then Peter shows Jameson some photos that look like they make the Spider-Man dumping Peter's clone photos look fake or forged, when really he forged the other photos. Like, he did some creative double exposures and stuff. So props to Peter for that. I mean, I have hard enough time in Photoshop. I can't imagine trying to doctor photos using physical things. I don't know. That's crazy. But it's been done. Then after Jameson leaves, Spider-Man swings around the city looking for trouble. And after an encounter with the police, he sees some creepy-looking people go into a building. And then there's another contradictory Spider-Sense situation. Spider-Sense not warning of danger, just calling attention to something. He says that. He says, it doesn't feel like my Spider-Sense is warning me of danger, just trying to call my attention to something. I guess that line he had a few years back about his Spider-Sense only picking up danger wasn't correct. Maybe he's just discovering that his Spider-Sense doesn't only pick up danger, but it does pick up other things. I will try to give them the benefit of the doubt on this one. But yeah, then Spider-Man ends up beating up all the guys who went into the building and meets a guy called Dr. Faustus, who is apparently from, I don't know, one of the other series, like Captain America or something like that. Then in issue 170, Faustus uses gas on Spider-Man that makes him see hallucinations. And I have to question, why doesn't Spider-Man always wear a gas mask? He's constantly being gassed and drugged, and he cannot seem to get it into his brain to wear a gas mask all the time, just in case. Idiot. Then, but Faustus seems to be like a little bit of a ripoff of Scarecrow from Batman. Kind of a lot. I mean, he's like a psychiatrist, and he uses hallucinogens on his patients as a mean of hypnotic control. Yeah. But he wanted to put his hallucinogen into the new flu vaccine that's going to be going through the city. And then Spider-Man eventually breaks his spell from, the gas, and then defeats Faustus and his goons. And then in issue 6 of Spectacular Spider-Man, Morbius comes back. Spider-Man has a headache, and Spider-Man and Human Torch fight Morbius. Some college kids interfere and try to fight Human Torch. Morbius flies away. Morbius is apparently on another planet at the end of the issue, and maybe the moon? I don't know. And he's talking to somebody, so don't really know who. And then in issue 7, Morbius comes back down to Earth, and it turns out he's being told what to do by some being called the Empathoid. And at first, he comes to Earth to feed on humans, but Empathoid makes Morbius succumb to his desire to kill Spider-Man because he feeds on emotions and he can sense Morbius's anger towards Spider-Man, so he fights Spider-Man. And then in issue 8 is a continuation, and Empathoid leaves Morbius's body and enters Spider-Man's because he can sense all these complex emotions and desires and everything. And then Empathoid, he feeds on emotions, and now Peter can kind of see like Empathoid's memories or whatever, and because they're one being now, kind of. And it turns out that Empathoid destroyed everybody on his home planet by feeding off everybody's emotions until they die. That's what he does. Like, he just feeds on somebody's emotions until they're just dead. And then he wants to feed off Spider-Man's emotions while he fights Morbius because he feels like it's going to draw in a lot of anger or something. And so when Spider-Man finds Morbius and everything, he leads them to a football game, and the high emotions of everybody in the stadium overwhelm the Empathoid, kind of like an overdose on drugs, and he leaves Spider-Man's body and becomes incapacitated. And then Morbius flies off because he has no beef with Spider-Man. He was angry at the Empathoid for being a jerk. But yeah, so he flies off and says, we'll leave this fight to another day. And yeah. Then 171 of Amazing Spider-Man. Well, this is an issue that is the second part of a 2-part story, and it started in an issue in a comic called Nova. It's a fairly new issue, or fairly new comic at the time, and I guess they were trying to sell that. They wanted to call people's attention to it, but yeah, I haven't read the first part, and I have no way of really getting to it. So I just kind of looked it up online, but yeah, I've never heard of Nova before this. So yeah, but in the end, I kind of liked him, so I guess it all made up for it. But they really should have just done this story in Marvel Team Up, and then said like, Nova issues on sale now, or something like that. Anyway, the story itself. Apparently some guy dies, and then all the suspects end up in the same room with a detective in charge of the investigation. The lights go out, somebody kills the butler just before he reveals who the killer is. That's what I gathered from the synopsis that I read of the first part of this story. So, I mean, I guess you'll just be as confused as I am. I was really confused for a lot of this because it had a bunch of characters that I'd never heard of before, and I just didn't know, and they, so I was confused. Yeah, it was just kind of difficult to get through. It was cool, but it was such a struggle because I hadn't read the first half of it, and yeah, it's like starting a movie halfway through that like is this whole like mystery, and like you haven't seen the first part of the mystery, and you're like, well, I don't know who any of these characters are, and it just doesn't really work. But basically, Nova and Spider-Man try to catch the fleeing killer or suspects and find them at a lighthouse. And the villain, called Photon, shows up and disables them and straps them to an anchor and drops them into the ocean. Then Nova and Spider-Man escape, and they go back to the scene of the crime where the first guy was murdered. And there's some invention that the Photon wants to steal, and then they defeat Photon and unmask him, and he's one of their suspects. So yeah, Nova seems like a pretty cool superhero, actually. I mean, you know, I like him. And I guess they succeeded in what they were trying to do because it made me want to go read the Nova comics.
So screw you, Marvel.
But yeah, one thing I like, but I also hate about Marvel. Maybe it's also true about DC. I don't know. They have a lot of footnotes in Spider-Man that talk about something that happened in another issue in another series, and they've mentioned like Marvel Team Up a lot, and Captain America and Fantastic Four and Daredevil and like all these others, and it's usually not essential reading. It's just kind of like they mention something that happened, or like a new villain shows up and you're not sure who he is, and they're like, he showed up in this issue over here. Spider-Man fought him before. Like, there's some little object that somebody has, and it's like, he first got this in this issue, or something like that, just to let you know. But but yeah, it's nice that they give you notes as to what happened and stuff. But I like it because it gives the Marvel universe like a lot of depth and expansiveness. But I hate it because it's just so much to catch up on. It's really overwhelming, to be honest. There's just so much. Why? Why is there so much? It's bad enough that there's 1,600 issues of Spider-Man. There's even more. There's more. There's Team Up. There's Marvel Team Up. And there's issues of Daredevil he's in. And, it's just there's so much. Issue 9 of Spectacular Spider-Man. The president of Empire State University, the school that Peter goes to, it's a fictional school. He decides to shut down the night school because of a lack of funding. And there's a lot of students that protest the decision. And one of the students is actually the White Tiger. He's a superhero in the Marvel universe. And he decides to steal some manuscripts from the school library that are supposedly worth a lot of money and would give the school enough money to keep the night school open. And so Spider-Man finds the White Tiger and the issue ends. And I gotta say, they need to stop doing these political thriller drama issues because, my goodness, I could not care less about what's going on at the university unless it's one of the teachers becoming a supervillain. Man. And there were lots of editor notes referencing other issues of other series in this one issue. It seemed like every single frame on every page had a note saying, like, ooh, ooh. Most of them were to Deadly Hands of Kung Fu, which the White Tiger is from. And it wasn't necessarily a bad thing, because, like, it was just like, if they didn't have those notes, I wouldn't really have thought anything of it because they were explaining what was happening. They were just kind of like, hey, this happened in this issue. So if you want to see the entire full story, go check it out. But, it was just a lot of notes. Man. And then in issue 10, Spider-Man fights the White Tiger, and it turns out one of the professors impersonated the White Tiger and stole the manuscript because he wanted to create like a symbol for the protesters and stuff. So, but the Spider-Man and the White Tiger stopped fighting, and after Spider-Man realizes that White Tiger is innocent, and they become friends. Then in issue 172 of Amazing Spider-Man, Spider-Man pursues a new villain called the Rocket Racer and catches him and hands him to the police. That's how the issue opens. Rocket Racer's pretty neat. Doesn't show up again this year. But then the Molten Man comes back and makes Liz his stepsister. It's Liz Allen, the same one that's engaged to Harry Osborn. Makes her steal chemicals from the hospital that she works at. And she gets caught and she gets sent to jail. And Molten Man then goes to the hospital himself to steal the chemicals, and Spider-Man fights him there. And then Molten Man gets the best of him and flees with the chemicals. Then in the next issue, 173, Molten Man gets some doctor to mix the chemicals in the proper way to make this antidote that he needs to cure his moltenness. And it cures it for a few seconds, but then it comes back in full force, and yeah. And then Liz is bailed out of jail by Joe Robertson, and then goes to talk with Molten Man, where he's making a big scene in some evacuated building, and usually requesting Liz to be there. And so Spider-Man rushes in and fights Molten Man. You know, again, like, Spider-Man recently, like this year specifically, has been fighting people for no good reason, a lot. And I blame Len Wein. And, but he rushes in, does not talk, just punches, and it's just like, man. Because, I don't know. Anyway, Spider-Man saves Liz Allen from the collapsing building and sets her on the street, and then the building collapses on the Molten Man. Liz blames herself for some reason, and then Harry is worried and upset. And, you know, I like the Molten Man. I think he'd make a good movie villain. He'd look good on the screen. Alright, issue 11 of Spectacular Spider-Man. Some guy saves Peter and MJ from getting hit by a truck, but then himself gets hurt in the process. Glass shards get stuck in his abdomen, and he's exposed to some kind of neurotoxin. And they need some serum from this medical facility downtown, and then Peter changes into Spider-Man to go look after the truck to make sure it gets to the destination. And Medusa has stolen the serum from the truck and then fights Spider-Man for a while. And apparently she needed the serum for one of her Inhuman friends who was trying to defuse a world-ending bomb. And not all of the serum was required, so Black Bolt, one of the Inhumans, some other hero, I don't know, something, flies the remainder of the serum to the hospital, and they give it to the guy just in the nick of time to save his life. Don't really know why they brought Medusa back. Anyway, 174 of Amazing Spider-Man. Hitman is hired to kidnap J. Jonah Jameson by the People's Liberation Front for printing unflattering things about them in the Daily Bugle. Punisher is going after the People's Liberation Front, hereby referred to as PLF for shortening purposes, and gets a lead that they're kidnapping Jameson. And Punisher and Spider-Man both break into Jameson's office at the same time and try to save him. Hitman escapes to the roof and gets into a two-man helicopter with Jameson. Spider-Man and Punisher are on the roof as well. And in the next issue, the immediate continuation, Hitman flies away, and Spider-Man and Punisher use a spider tracer to track down the helicopter to a barn. Hitman isn't there anymore. Two goons let them know that Hitman and his employer at the PLF are at the Statue of Liberty with Jameson. Spider-Man and Punisher fly there in the helicopter for the final showdown. It's pretty awesome, too. In this issue, we get a little bit of Punisher backstory, some stuff about Vietnam and his connection with the Hitman. And also, I didn't know this. I didn't find this out until just now, but Punisher's first appearance ever in anything was actually back during the issues with the Jackal of the Spider-Man. And it's Jerry Conway, one of my favorite writers thus far, actually dreamed him up and did the first initial sketch of his idea of what the Punisher would be. And even at this point in 1977, Punisher still didn't have his own series. He was just making guest appearances in other comics, mostly in Spider-Man comics. And yeah, he didn't actually get his own series until the 80s. So I didn't know that. Just a little extra tidbit. Anyway, in a minor subplot, Harry is very distraught over the fact that Liz, his fiancée, has left without word, moved away without any warning, and she was apparently distraught over the supposed death of her stepbrother, the Molten Man. I say supposed because at any given point he could come back and be like, oh yeah, I narrowly escaped death that time, because last time he supposedly died too. So, I'm just saying supposed death as opposed to death, because you can never be sure. But then during a therapy session, Harry beats his therapist to death and claims that the Green Goblin is back. Or that it's time for the Green Goblin or something like that. Then in issue 12 of Spectacular Spider-Man, Flash has been seeing this girl named Shashan that he met in Vietnam at some restaurant, but the restaurant owner named Korba has been trying to shoo him away, saying there is no girl by that name here. But now things start to come to a head because Flash finally finds out that Shashan is married to Korba. And then in this issue he discovers that Korba is the leader of a cult called the Legion of Light that brainwashes people just to steal things from them. And then if Korba holds hands with Shashan, they can both emit this powerful light beam from their chests that acts as like a hard punch to the face. Flash keeps provoking fights by trying to get Shashan to snap out of it or whatever. And yeah, then in the next issue, 13 of Spectacular Spider-Man, Spider-Man runs into a new hero called Razorback. At first he fights him because he thinks he's a villain, and then Razorback's like, that's how all superheroes greet in New York, that's what I heard. You know, he's apparently from like Arkansas or something like that. Spider-Man's like, really? You're fighting me just to introduce yourself? Anyway, Razorback's actually pretty cool. He wears a boar's head with an electrified mane running down his back. And Razorback wants to take down the Legion of Light as well for kidnapping and brainwashing his sister. And Korba and Shashan get away, and Razorback, Spider-Man, and Flash follow a tracer from Razorback's souped-up truck. It's a big rig called Big Pig. They get to the compound where Korba and Shashan are, and it turns out the person behind the cult is actually a guy called Hate Monger, originally a Fantastic Four villain, I believe. Basically, Spider-Man and the gang can't manage to defeat all the goons and end up chained in a dungeon with a bomb. So yeah, that's where the year ends. There was also an annual, but since it's not part of the overall story, I'm not going to really go into the details about what it was about. It was just, it was a decent enough story, but nothing too crazy. So yeah, I guess next year we will be seeing the return of the Green Goblin, and also the continuation of this Hate Monger storyline. So yeah, it was a decent year. It was definitely better than 76. The Punisher issue was pretty awesome. Yeah, it had some pretty cool villains that I'd never heard of before, and it had its meh moments, but overall it was pretty decent. So yeah, I guess I'll see you next time with issues 176 through 187 of Amazing Spider-Man, and issues 14 through 25 of Spectacular Spider-Man. I'm sure there's an annual or two in there somewhere. Yeah. So yeah.